from the Lord. It's right there in the Word for your mind, your body, and your soul. It's right there in the Word. The Word of God will set you free. It's right there in the Word. Eternalizing is the key. It's right there in the Word. It's right there in the Word. It's right there in the Word. It's right there.
Hey, greetings, Word family. Welcome to another Wednesday installment of There's a Word for That, the weekly word presentation as part of the Hymns with Phil Carter Fellowship. I'm Pastor Cynthia Turner-Wood. I want to take a minute to just congratulate Phil and Stephanie Carter on this past Monday's banquet, honoring some of the finest pastors and gospel artists, musicians in this area and beyond, but also to thank them for their recent releases of their books and that will strengthen the kingdom. And most recently, just this week, Phil's book, Hymns Matter. I pre-ordered my copy. I'm looking forward to receiving it and reading it because I honestly, when I say I cannot imagine where my life would be without the hymns, I really mean I cannot imagine where I would be without hymns to pull me through and bring me up and pull me out and beckon me back to Christ in moments of crisis. So, congratulations, and we look forward to the works that you will do. Look forward to reading the book. All right, let's go ahead and get to work. Today's word comes from Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verse 46, which says, "Then they came to Jericho, and Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving a city. As they were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.'" One of the toughest challenges facing every believer at some point or another is figuring out how to get back on track after life has stalled. How do you jumpstart after being sidelined? How do you craft a new beginning when it all seems to have ended? Because let's face it, we are not always on course. All of us have spiritual highs that lift us up and give us confidence and make us feel bold. But we also have those lows that cause us to wonder whether we've got what it takes to make it, whether we can really pull ourselves through this time, whether will ever be back on track. I sometimes wish that I had a spiritual switch that I could just flick to turn on the power in my life when I'm feeling physically sluggish and slow, when my walk seems drab and uneventful. Sometimes I wish that there was a formula, a model, a recipe that I could whip up to pull myself out of the rut and get myself back to a place of passion and creativity and engagement and excitement with God. And you don't have to say anything. I know that you do too. I know I'm not the only one who struggles in this area. We're not supposed to admit it out loud, but I'll go ahead and talk about it because the truth is the light. And the truth is that sometimes it's hard to muscle ourselves up and roll ourselves out of the bed of passivity when our faith libido is low and when our zeal has come and gone and our vision is hope. Our vision of hope is dim. Or sometimes it just feels like we can't get it together. And I believe that was the challenge facing blind Bartimaeus that day. He had fallen into a place of not just physical blindness, but also a protracted spiritual lameness and brokenness and spiritual blindness. And he could not get out of it. In fact, he had so long been in his condition that the community stopped referring to him as simply Bartimaeus. Instead, they began tagging him by his affliction. So identified is he with his affliction down through the centuries that even if I didn't say to you blind Bartimaeus, those of us who know just a little bit of Bible would have already attached that moniker to his name. You would have been thinking hashtag blind Bart because that just goes along with his name. He's been that way for so long. And that's how it is with us. When we've been in a condition so long, we are no longer just known by our name, but we are more prominently labeled by our name and our condition. School kids are especially cruel when it comes to this. They'll call somebody Crazy Willie or Wild Child Sabrina, or my husband used to go to school with somebody who they used to call Bigfoot Sally. I mean, the kids are cruel in that way, but we do the same thing with adults. We end up identifying people by their problem. But worse than being labeled by others is when we get to the place where we answer to the labels that they have given us. It's one thing to be called out of your name. It's a whole nother thing to answer to it. Because if we're not careful, if we hear it long enough, we'll start believing what they say about us. Tell a child long enough that they'll never amount to anything. And guess what? They'll start living that out. Keep on beating up on your spouse and saying how no good you consider them to be. And guess what? They'll be no good. And unless somebody comes along to change that perception, they'll forever replay the negative tapes in their head, convincing themselves that they are the affliction that other people have labeled them with. But I came by today to say the devil is a liar. I came by to remind somebody today that with Christ, your future does not have to be held hostage by your present. Who you are right now does not have to be who you will be tomorrow. The saints of old used to say, even though I have not arrived to where I'm going to be, and even though I'm not where I ought to be, thanks be to God, I'm not where I used to be. I'm a work in progress. I'm still on the potter's wheel. I'm a diamond in the rough, a pearl in the making. In fact, if you're going to label me at all, don't label me by my wrongs. Label me by my rights, what's going right in my life. And if you don't see anything right now, keep looking, because God is in the midst of this thing, and I'm about to get off of where I am and get back on track again. That's why I love the story I read one time of the homeless man who sat across the street from an artist's studio. From his window, the artist sketched the poor man's face every day that he saw him sitting there. And after completing the sketch, he began to add some color to the face. And as the brilliant tones brushed across the canvas, the unfortunate man's face began to change. Into the eyes, the artist put a glint of an inspired dreamer. He brightened the skin to give the impression of health. He painted the hair in such a way as to present it clean and tidy. And when the work was finished, the artist went outside and got the man and brought him over and said, "Look at this picture. Who is this man in the painting?" And the beggar said, "I don't know. Who is that in the painting?" And then he looked a little bit more closely and he said, "Wait a minute. Is that me? Can that really be me?" And the painter replied, "Yes, that is you. That's how I see you." And the man squared his shoulders a little bit and stood up straighter than he had ever stood in a long time and said, "Well, then that's who I'll be." And all of us need somebody in our lives to love us enough to see us for what we can be and see us for who we could be, even though we may not in that moment be performing that way. Don't you ever let anybody's negative definition of you that they give to you determine who you're going to be. You are not your condition. You are not your problem. You are not your predicament. You are what God created you to be, and the effort that it took for God to knit you together, not thrown together, not just happenstance, but no, knit one pearl two together by God's very own hands, placing in you a set of gifts and talents and ways of being in the world that were meant to bring about a better world. Fearfully and wonderfully made are we. We are a designer's original. That's where we find blind Bartimaeus in this story. I don't know where he got the nerve that day. I don't know what gave him the drive after being off track for so long. But when he got the news that Jesus was passing by that day, he got busy yelling out to him and calling him by name. Jesus, Son of David. Both of those names, Jesus, where he was, but son of David, I know who you are. I know your lineage. I know where you come from. I know that you've got a connection to God. That's what he was saying when he threw that son of David in there. I know that there's some history and some legacy there. I know that you are the promised one who was come into the world. Those were the words that he identified with Jesus. But those who were with Jesus heard Bartimaeus crying out, "Have mercy on me." And they said, "Man, why don't you hush up? Why don't you be quiet? We're over here close to him. We got what we need from him. We're not so much worried about you. We've already been healed. We've been chosen. We've been picked." Those who were close to him had no regard for Bartimaeus's condition. They said, "We're celebrating the triumphal entry, and don't you spoil our party with all that noise that you're making over there." Oh, but the more they tried to hush him, the louder he called, "Jesus, son of David, hey, have mercy on me, have mercy on me." And the lesson is, for all of us to come out of a rut, to get back on track, you need to call on Jesus. That's right. You need to call on his name regardless of what everybody else is saying. You need to call on his name no matter how stifling your situation is, how perplexing your predicament is, how complicated your condition is. If you can just call on Jesus, if you seek him, the Bible says you will find him when you seek him with your whole heart. Call upon him, the Bible says, while he is near. "Father, I stretch my hand to thee. No other help I know." Call him in the morning and call him in the evening and call him at supper time. Just call him. Others may say, "What's the use? Why are you calling him? Look at you, been in this condition all this time. You know who you are. You know you always meant to be that way." But call him anyway. Friends may say, "Hush up all that noise," but call him anyway. Your church neighbor in the seat next to you when you go to church might say, "Oh, it don't take all that." But call him anyway. Don't sit by them anymore, but just call Jesus anyway, because when you call him, he will answer. What Bartimaeus proved when he called Jesus son of David was that even though he was blind, he had more sight than a lot of those who could see. It's one thing to be physically blind, where you cannot catch a glimpse of the things around you. Oh, but it's a whole nother thing to be spiritually blind, so that when your help is in the vicinity, you don't even know it. The Bible talks about those who have eyes but cannot see, and ears but cannot hear. They are dead to spiritual things. Bartimaeus, though blind, set his sights on Jesus in order to get his needs met, because he could see more in his blind state than those who had some sight. And he understood that in order to get certain needs met that we cannot fulfill ourselves, we need to call on that name that is above every other name. Augustine says, listen, all of us have a God-sized hole inside of us that cries out, and it will not be filled until we find our rest in God. Try to fill it with friends, with sex, with money, with alcohol, with fame, with fortune, with Netflix and chill, with whatever, with weed and all of those other things. You can do that. Those are all temporary fixes, but they will never fill the God-sized hole, because nothing will satisfy the longing for God except for God. But listen, secondly, to get out of this rut, Bartimaeus lets us know that you've got to trust Jesus to answer when you call. The text says that when Jesus heard Bartimaeus, he stood still. He stopped. He says, he paused for a moment while everybody else wanted to keep going and push Bartimaeus aside. No, Jesus said, wait a minute, hold up. And I believe that there's something in the sincere, desperate cry out to the Lord that the Lord cannot resist. I believe that his ears perk up and his heart is inclined to the cries of his children, and he cannot help but answer us when we cry out in faith. It says Jesus stood still, and when he stopped, he told the crowd that was telling Bartimaeus to be quiet and go away, he told them, Go get him and bring him to me. And everyone who had been chiding him to be quiet began to encourage him to get to Jesus. Isn't it funny how fickle folks are? Even church folks, and maybe even especially church folks, how fickle they can be when you are in need. One minute they're telling you to hush up and go away and get well on your own, and you've been sick too long, and we're tired of it. We dealt with you for a minute, but we ain't got time for you no more. One minute they're saying that, hush up, and then the next minute they're congratulating you for not hushing because Jesus has answered your call, because Jesus has seen to your need, because Jesus has turned things around. This teaches us that if we're going to get out of a rut, we must call him, but we must also stay unwavering in our trust that Jesus will answer when we call. By the same token, Bartimaeus had to understand that he had to silence the voice of the crowd and listen for the voice of Christ. This goes right along with this point right here, that even though the crowd is calling out, and even though the crowd is saying, here's what you need to do, and you need to be quiet. No, you don't listen to the crowds. You listen for the voice of Christ. We need to silence the crowds that attempt to limit the power and potential of God in our lives. If Bartimaeus had paid attention to the crowd, he would have hushed his own voice, and then Jesus would have never heard him. And if Jesus would have never heard him, he would have never stopped. And if Jesus would have never stopped, then Bartimaeus would have spent the rest of his days on that mat begging others for what he needed rather than getting what he needed for himself. There's wisdom, I tell you, in calling out to Jesus louder, in a way that is louder than the crowd that is telling you to be quiet. But finally, to try to get out of a rut, we must try God's time. Oh, no. We must trust God's timing, because oftentimes, it seems like God is too late. It seems like God has missed us. It seems like God has missed the moment. No, but here's the thing. We have to trust God's timing, because though he had been blind a long time, it didn't take Jesus very long to reverse his course when Jesus gets ready to do so. Stopped in his track by the earnest cries of the blind man, he calls to the crowd and tells them to call him. Bartimaeus gets up, throws off his cloak, and comes running over to Jesus. He's running over. He wastes no time. He hears Jesus call his name in response to him calling Jesus' name, and he asked Jesus for a response. Jesus answered, and Bartimaeus comes a running. And that's how we ought to be too. When we hear that response, we ought to not wait or miss a moment. And he asks him, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus says. We know that Jesus didn't ask this because he didn't know Bart was blind. No, he asked it so that Bart could state what he really believed that Jesus could do for him. The blind man said, teacher, a term of endearment, the term that Jesus's mother used to address him. He said, teacher, let me see again. And when he makes this request of Jesus, it's packed with all kinds of possibility, packed with faith. It is packed with the belief in who Jesus is and what Jesus can do. It's an expression of an expectation of Jesus's ability to begin working in his life. It's a conviction of Jesus's compassion. It's a testimony of the trust of the one who can do anything. And that's how we need to come to him. We need to approach him in such a way that we know and believe and trust that he can do anything in our situation. But notice he says this. Listen to what he said. He does not just say, let me see. He says, let me see again. Again, that's the literal reading of it. Let me see again, because most of the time we preach it as if this is Bartimaeus' first time ever seeing, as if he's been blind since birth. But the true translation is let me see again, which implies that there was a time when he saw, when he understood, when he focused, but somewhere along the way, he lost his ability. Isn't that how it is for us sometimes? Come on, don't blame him. Don't rag on him. We sometimes saw better in the past than what we see right now. But here's the thing. We understand when we hear this again, we understand that Bartimaeus is praying now. I used to see before, but something happened and I lost my sight. So let me see again. I used to be something, but something happened and now I'm not so much. So let me be something again. I used to have it together, but somewhere the things fell apart along the way. Let me have it together again. I used to know what it meant to follow you, but I got blinded by some other things, enticed by some other things, distracted by some other things, and now I don't follow so closely, but let me follow closely again. I don't know what your prayer is today. I don't know what your again request might be, but I want you to know that Jesus hears it. If you pray it, if you call out to him, but a good place to start is to do what Bartimaeus did and said, let me have it again. Give it back to me, Lord. Where is that blessedness I knew when first I met the Lord? Where is that soul refreshing view of Jesus and his word? And I don't want you to miss this, because the text tells us that when he leaped up to approach Jesus, he threw off his cloak and left it behind. And there's something in there too that's teachable for us. If we're going to get going again with new eyesight, new insight, new outlook, we need to leave some stuff behind that might trip us up as we try to get to Jesus. The cloak is what he sat on when he was begging. The cloak is what he carried with him when he was in the condition of blindness. It's where he collected his alms and his gifts. Oh, but with the symbolism of him leaving that cloak behind, he's saying, listen, I know that if I can just get to Jesus when he's called me to come to him, I'm not going to need this cloak anymore. And I don't need to be tripped up by anything in the past. I don't need to be carrying the baggage of the past, because I know that Jesus has something for me. It was likely a long cloak and likely a cumbersome cloak. So when he leaves it behind, he's saying, I believe that since Jesus called me to come over to him, something's going to change in my life. I won't need that old stuff anymore. My situation's going to change. When I get my sight back, I'll have a new walk and I'll have a new talk and a brand new way of living. Cloaks are for beggars. And since Jesus answered my call, I won't be begging. I won't be out here begging anymore. Bartimaeus knew that you cannot enter the presence of Jesus and come away the same as you were before. Something ought to happen that changes who you are, so that when he stood before Jesus and requested his sight again, when he finally got to him, Jesus answered him quickly, "Gone, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight. Somebody say immediately. Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. This was Jesus' last miracle before going to Jerusalem to be crucified. In fact, when he was passing through Jericho on his way to the Passover to share with the Last Supper with his disciples, he met Bartimaeus on the way. And I'm so glad we serve the kind of God who, even though he's on an important mission, even though he's got a huge assignment in front of him, even though this is earth-shattering stuff that is awaiting him, he doesn't feel it robbery to stop and take care of a trivial cry to answer a blind child who needs help getting going again, who needs help to get back on track. Thank God for a God who hears us when we cry and answers the cries of his children. But don't get so caught up in the shouting that you miss the message, because when Jesus restored Bartimaeus' sight, he did it with a mandate to go. Go, go, go. So often we come to Jesus to get what we want without ever thinking about what Jesus wants in return. Truth be told, this is where the church often gets stuck. We forget to go. We come Sunday after Sunday and get what we want, but we don't go forward to do anything in his name. But the message of the gospel is a message to go. Go ye therefore and teach all nations. Go out into the highways and the byways. Go tell somebody else the good news of Jesus Christ, that he still heals, delivers, and set free. Go tell it on the mountain. When Bartimaeus did not know, what Bartimaeus did not know was that in just a little while, the celebratory chants of this crowd would turn to the hateful roar from the same group. But here's the thing. He had to understand that in just a little while, those unblinded eyes would see the Son of David with a crown of thorns on his head, with nails in his hands and in his feet, on Calvary's cross, in just a little while, his sight would be restored, but he would also hear the one who heard him and hear him cry out in his own blindness, my God, why have you forsaken me? In just a little while, Bart might even be wishing that he were blind once more so that he would not have to witness man's cruelty to Jesus Christ. Oh, but if he hung in there a little while longer, a little while after that, he'd be glad he got that sight back, because once stalled on the cross and once stuck in the grave, the one that got going again. And when he did, he threw off his cloak, he threw off his death garments, he threw off all of the wood and the nails and the crowns and the thorns. He threw all of that off because he would not need that anymore. As a matter of fact, he even threw off the grave and left that behind, because early on Sunday morning, he got up with all power in his hands, got up from the dead, got up from misery, got up from being sidelined and sidetracked, got up from all that humanity did to him. And because he got up, we can get up and we can get going again. Thanks be to God that he rose. Hey, listen, I am a little over my time today. I got excited with that one. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I know you were blessed. This is Pastor Cynthia Turner-Wood. I'll see you next week for another installment of There's a Word for That. Until then, know that whatever the issue is, there is a word for that. For the grass withers and the flower fades, and the word of our God shall last. But the word of our God shall last forever, shall stand forever. Thank you for listening. God bless you, and have a great week.